بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Water. Water is something that at best we take for granted. Water is something that for Kuwait, with its port locations on the Arabian Gulf, has always been accessible. Fresh, portable water, either brought by boat, as was previously necessary, then currently by coastal water desalination plants. But what about the towns in the central desert areas of the Arabian Peninsula? They have been in existence with neither seaports nor desalination plants for more than centuries. Arabia has often been misrepresented as a place of vast deserts, devoid of enough water to support human habitation. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Jérémie Schiettecatte, will present archaeological results that create a more accurate understanding. Dr. Schiettecatte is a colleague of last week's lecturer, Dr. Jérémie Schiettecatte. Both are archaeologists interested in the archaeology of the Arabian Peninsula and Ethiopia from prehistoric times and onward. Like Jérémie Schiettecatte, Jérémie Schiettecatte has participated in many archaeological expeditions in this area. He has also published on the different circumstances that enabled the settlement of towns in eastern Arabia, as well as south of that is Yemen. As part of his interest in the analysis of the evolution of the settlement patterns in the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa from the Bronze Age to late antiquity, Dr. Schiettecatte will be delivering a lecture entitled An Archaeological Account of the Settlement Process in Central Arabia, 3000 BC to 18,000 CE, results of the Saudi-French archaeological mission in al-Kharj. Dr. Schiettecatte has an intimate knowledge of this project since he directed it from 2011 to 2016. There was no need at that time for mobile phones during the settlements for any of these areas. So I hope there is no need for your mobile phones in here as well. Please turn them off and let's welcome Dr. Jérémie Schiettecatte.
Thank you very much for this nice and kind introduction. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and it's a pleasure for me to be invited in these conferences organized by the Center, because it's a first time for me, the first opportunity to come in Kuwait, the first opportunity to meet several people, and the first opportunity to show you this archaeological account of the settlement process in Central Arabia from the Bronze Age to the modern period. If I would have to do this conference 10 years ago, it would have been quite difficult because at that time there were so many works which had been carried out in Central Arabia from an archaeological point of view. And it's now possible to present you something because, as it has just been said, we have been carried out a Saudi-French archaeological mission in al-Kharj during 6 field seasons plus 1 season of study of material and analysis. And this project was conducted by Abdelaziz Al-Ghazi from King Saud University and myself. At the beginning, the project, since, as I said, almost nothing has been done before, the project purpose was a study of the regional occupation from its beginning, from prehistory, to the modern period. And there were several issues, several questions directing our researchers. What are the different kinds of human presence? What kind of economy people developed? How did they develop a subsistence strategy in a difficult environment? How they made the most of the rare sources of water to be able to develop agriculture, to practice agriculture, and get inserted into trading networks and connected to the other parts of the peninsula. So these were the different questions behind the project. As you can see, we have several parts that we studied: environment, prehistory, proto-history, historical periods. Tonight, I will not develop the prehistory for at least two reasons. The first one is that I would lack of time to show you this part of the work. And the second reason is that there is someone who is much more skilled than I am to do this. It's Rémi Grassard, of course. He already talked last week about the desert kites, and I'm pretty sure that he would be delighted to show you something different on the Paleolithic in the Arabian Peninsula. So let it apart for tonight, and I will focus on the proto-history, which are the Bronze Age, 3rd, 2nd millennium BC, the Iron Age, the 1st millennium BC, and what I called the historical period, which is the time when script appears in the middle of the 1st millennium BC, and then the Islamic period. There is a kind of consistency in dealing with this long 5 millennia of time, the proto-history and historical periods. If I chose tonight to deal with this long period, it's for the simple reason that around 3000 BC, approximately, the climate became arid and remained almost the same during these last 5 millenniums. So we have 5 millenniums of aridity, and it's interesting to see how communities, how people cope with this harsh environment and try to succeed in developing an urbanization in this region, and then agriculture and so on. We are in Central Arabia, and a first question when we arrived in this region, and it has just been raised before in the presentation, is to determine where are the water sources. Is there water for people to live in that region? The region I'm talking about is al-Kharj area. It's a town, quite large, modern town, located just nearby Riyadh, southeast of Riyadh. It's almost the suburb these days of Riyadh. But we are here 80 kilometers to the southeast, and we surveyed this 100 kilometers wide region and 60 kilometers from north to south to see what were the archaeological sites of that region. And this area is very interesting from an environmental point of view, because we are at the very location of the convergence of surface water flows and groundwater and underground water flows. So you can see that this long mountain range that we call the Jebel Tuwaik, this mountain range, is cut by valleys that we call the Central Arabian Graben System. These are large valleys that allows wadi flows to go through the mountain and reach the eastern part. So there is this convergence of all the waters coming from the western part of Central Arabia toward this small location, plus the Wadi Hanifa coming from the north, the Wadi Al-Ain coming from the south, and all these water flows are just converging in a small funnel-shaped location, which is al-Kharj. So it's quite easy to find by just digging wells. At a low depth, it's easy to find water and then to develop agriculture, at least easy with modern pumping systems, which is another issue. So this is one of these valleys. It's the Wadi Nisa that you can see here with these modern agricultural fields. And there is also other specific features in that region. First, here, this red star in the middle is an artesian spring, so a natural spring of fresh water just in the middle of the oasis. And besides, we have here in these yellow stars at these locations something that is rather most unusual that we call the sinkhole. A sinkhole is a karstic formation. It's a formation, a geological formation that happens in limestone with the chemical dissolution of limestone. When the rainwaters are entering the stone, it creates some cavities, some caves, and these caves become bigger and bigger. And at what time? The roof collapses. And then you have these huge holes, and this is how it looks on the ground. It's 80 meters high, 80 meters wide, and we have 4 of them. Today, of course, it's just an empty hole. It's of no use for the water use. But if it's empty, this is simply because there have been, during these last 40 years, heavy pumping of the groundwaters. So the water table just gets lower and lower, and it's now 400 meters under the surface of the ground. But if you look at this picture of the 70s, it's a picture from the Aramco found, you can see that water was just, let's say, approximately 15 meters below the surface. You can see someone swimming in that water. And Philby, in the 20s, in the 1920s, mentions that Philby was a British diplomat and also an archaeologist who spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. He describes this area, and he mentions that water was just 8 meters below the surface. So before mechanical pumping of the water table, there was in these sinkholes available fresh water for the people living in the neighborhood. So we have these artesian springs, the sinkholes, the wadi flows that make this region a well-watered region in the middle of an arid area. So we conducted some surveys of this region, and we discovered a set of archaeological sites. Those in yellow are the prehistorical sites that I won't talk about today. In blue, these are Bronze Age sites. I will develop about some of them. And in red, it's the historical late pre-Islamic and Islamic archaeological sites. And I will focus on the different excavation we did. And I decided to show you the different sites we excavated period by going back into time from the modern period until the Bronze Age, as the archaeologists would do just by excavating and going deeper and deeper. And I will show you, firstly, the excavation we did in one of the main sites in the oasis, al-Yamama, where we excavated a town occupied in the Islamic period, in the pre-Islamic period, and then we will move to 2 necropolises here and then, which are the biggest ones in the area where we did excavations of tombs from the Bronze and Iron Age. So let's start with the modern occupation, what I call the late 15th to the 18th, early 19th century CE. This modern occupation was discovered and excavated on the site of al-Yamama that I mentioned before. The site of al-Yamama is well known in different historical sources. It's known in pre-Islamic inscriptions. It was named Jowan, and then in Islamic sources, Yaqut, Baladuri, al-Hamdani, then it was named Jo al-Yamama, or Jo al-Khadarim, Jo al-Khidrima, it depends on the sources, and today it's simply known as al-Yamama. This is the main archaeological site in the entire oasis. It's quite huge. It's 1 kilometer from north to south and 600 meters wide. So it's 60 hectares. Of course, compared with sites in Mesopotamia, for example, it's not that big. But in the Arabian Peninsula, it's among the widest archaeological sites we know for the time being. And on the surface of that site, it was the first slide that you had at the beginning, we can see outcropping walls, just outcropping mud brick walls, which have been filled, covered by sand. And these are the remains of the latest occupation of that city. So it was a town abandoned at the end of the 18th century with a lot of dwellings, and in the central part, a large building that I will describe later. So we did different soundings, excavations. I won't enter into detail for every one of them. We discovered dwellings, open air areas, but the most interesting feature we excavated for this occupation is the Great Mosque, the Friday Mosque of the site. We discovered it by chance by excavating a deep sounding just here. In fact, we did a trench along the slope of the site, and in the corner of the trench, we discovered 2 columns, and then we extended the excavation and had this very well-preserved building. It's preserved over more than 2 meters high, which is unusual for archaeological remains. And the reason of this good conservation is that it was just filled with sand quite rapidly, and the sand preserved the mosque. And this is what we call the stratigraphic section, with the filling of the sand inside the mosque. And by studying in excavation this filling, we discovered 4 different floors in that mosque, which are the different periods of the modern occupation of the site. The lower floor, it's a beautiful plaster floor. It's a floor which is very important for us, because I will come back again about this floor later. But what is important to say is that the walls and the columns have been built above the floor, which is unusual. When you build a house, you build the walls, you build the columns, and then you lay the plaster floor. Never the opposite. So here it's the opposite. The walls, the structures have been just laid over this floor. Anyway, this is the first occupation of that building. Then it filled with sand, and we have several layers, kind of crust of hard sand with footprints. You have some footprints here with the toes, and you also have the imprints of palm leaf mat. And then we have a second floor and the third floor with always these same imprints. So one of our points was the capacity to date the occupation of that building, which was well preserved. So as archaeologists do, usually we did C14 datings of charcoals, and we had quite a wide chronological range. It's not very useful, because we can just see that the mosque was occupied somewhere between the late 15th and the 20th century, which doesn't help that much. For a simple reason is that there is some difficulty for the calibration in recent period of that datings. I don't enter into detail. But this is a first indication. We have the beginning and the end of the possible occupation of the mosque. And much more interesting is the material, the very few artifacts we discovered inside the mosque. Glass bangles. We have these small flints, which are the D-shaped gun flints that were inserted in the rifles. So these are typical of the 17th century. We have lead musket bullets for the rifles. We have also an Ottoman clay pipe bowl, and Chinese porcelain, the Batavian ware, which is in fact a production of China. It's a chocolate glazed cupwares. We have Celadon ware and also some fruitware from Iran, which are indicating that the building was occupied during the late 16th to the late 18th century. So by comparisons with traditional architecture, it has been possible to propose some reconstructions which have been done by an architect and colleague of mine, Christian Dahl, who proposed 2 options for the ceiling of that mosque. The first one is just a flat roof, comparable to the mosque of al-Fashra. And the other possibility is that one with arches above the pillars, supporting the ceiling, kill arches, and this is a possibility because of comparisons we can do with the traditional architecture, Islamic architecture in the region. But this is all the more probable that we discovered in the courtyard the shaft of a column and the capital, which comes at the top of the column. It's a crow-stepped capital, which is indicative of that kind of covering. So this is the late Islamic occupation of the site. Then, if we keep going down, we discovered below this modern occupation a former early Islamic occupation on that site, which has been dated, as you see here, from the 1st century of Hijr, the 7th century, to the 12th century. And we discovered this occupation in 3 different locations. One is just a small sanding in the sand with no specific architectural features. But we also discovered a mosque, which from the early Islam, and a pottery workshop outside of the fence of the site. I showed you before this late Islamic mosque, and I mentioned this plaster floor, the beautiful plaster floor at the bottom of the mosque. I said that all this was built above the plaster floor, and it was really interesting to have a closer look at this plaster floor, because when you look at it, this is the plaster floor, you can see that it comes against former built structures in mud bricks. You can see here some remains. We have here a pillar which has been leveled, erased. We have second pillar, a column. We have some abutments. We have a wall and different devices which have been just deleted, removed for the building of the late Islamic mosque. So this is the plan of the late Islamic mosque, and we tried to draw in dark gray all these leveled remains. And if I isolate these remains, you can see that we already have a prayer hall of a previous mosque. It's almost as big as it is in the late Islamic period. It's the same size, but with only 2 naves, 2 rows of pillars, and it's approximately looking like this. So that was very interesting to have this early Islamic mosque, because so far in Saudi Arabia, in Central Arabia, we have no idea of what was the Islamic architecture in the early Islamic period. So we did some reconstructions, and there is also a specific device in that building that is interesting. It's a crack on the ground here, a long line that we reconstructed here as a screen, and here is the crack that we can see. It's an Anchorage system for a wooden screen. And this wooden screen separated 2 sides in the prayer hall. We called it a maksura. It's something which is well known in the Umayyad period, in particularly in Basra, in Kufa, in Damascus, in Fustat. And the purpose of that screen was to delineate a specific area in the prayer hall devoted to the governor, the local governor, or the caliph, and the public area in the mosque. So we have some evidence of that, of such a screen in the mosque of al-Yamama. Now, of course, I'm talking about an early Islamic mosque, but from what time? There is absolutely no material in these early Islamic levels, no pottery sherds, no artifacts. So the only possibility to have dating of that mosque was to sample in the plaster floor small charcoals. You can see here we have 3 plaster floors in a thickness of 15 centimeters, 3 successive plaster floors belonging to this earlier structure, and we sampled small charcoals within the plaster that we dated. And what is interesting to see is that the first and the most ancient floor is dated from the end of the 1st century of Hijr, which is the late 7th, early 8th century AD. and the upper plaster floors of the same early Islamic mosque are from the Abbasid period, from the 8th and 9th century CE. So this is, in al-Yamama, the most ancient mosque excavated so far in Saudi Arabia and possibly also in the entire Arabian Peninsula. And what's interesting is to compare that mosque with the early Islamic mosque that we know from archaeological context in the Hijaz and the Najd. There are very few examples. We know 5 mosques excavated in archaeological context in Al-Rabada on the Darb al-Zubaydah in the Hijaz, along the pilgrimage road, Al-Ukhdud, which is Najran, close to the Asir region, the Mosque of Faid, close to Hail, but it was not published, and we don't have any plan of that building so far, which is from the Abbasid period, and the Mosque of Jurash in the Al-Bahar region, which is also from the Abbasid period. But anyway, by comparing the Mosque of al-Yamama, the early Islamic remains at al-Yamama with the other mosque, we can see that they were directly inspired from the Mosque of the Prophet at Medina, for which we have some hypothetical reconstructions. We have a prayer hall, which is 20 to 30 meters wide. We have 2 to 3 colonnades parallel to the Qibla wall. We have a flat roof resting directly on the pillars. There is systematically an opening onto the courtyard with the same proportions, with the absence of minarets, with this absence of decoration. And what's interesting to see with these mosques is that there is absolutely no influence from other traditional architecture. In Oman, in Yemen, the pre-Islamic religious architecture influenced the architecture of the mosques. In Syria, in Mesopotamia, it's the same. Here we have a traditional architecture which has no influence from elsewhere, and that I would qualify from a kind of Hijazi, Najdi Islamic architecture. Now, as I said, on the same site, we were quite lucky to find this pottery workshop. It's out of the fence. This is the protected site. And on the ground, when we walked around the site, we discovered some strange pottery shards just on the ground. We decided to make, at the beginning, a small trench, 10 meters by 1 meter, so it's a very small trench. And Michel Mouton, who did that trench, discovered just a part of that kiln. Then, 2 years later, in 2016, we expanded the excavation of that area, and we were lucky enough to excavate a pottery workshop. We only unearthed an area of 14 meters by 5.5 meters, so it's just a part of the workshop. The workshop was quite bigger and larger than this, but we already have some specific features, some rooms devoted to domestic use, a clay storage room, and the most interesting part is the courtyard where firing activity took place. We have here 3 pottery kilns and 2 tannours, and one of them is very well preserved. It's 3 by 2 meters. It's a big pottery kiln with the firing chamber below, well preserved. It's more than 1.2 meter high. We can enter entirely into this firing chamber, and the pottery were just fired at the top of this kiln in the heating room, with the heat coming through these flues and hitting the potteries. Inside, we discovered some tools used by potters, stone tools, a wheel which is used to turn the potteries. This is the local production. We discovered more than 4,000 fragments of this local production. It's very homogeneous. It's always the same fabric. The shapes are almost always the same. It's bowls, basins, jars, and that's it, with the same kind of decoration. So homogeneous production all along the use of this workshop. And very few imports, pottery imports. These are important for us to date the occupation of this workshop. These are blue-green alkaline glazed pottery coming from southern Iraq and Iran, produced in the 9th and 10th century AD. And these are plain white glazed pottery produced at the same period of time. So we have the 9th and 10th century potteries imported and discovered in the workshop. And this is consistent with the dating we had by the C14 analysis, which shows that this pottery workshop was used during the 9th and 10th century AD. So this is what we discovered for the early Islamic period in the site of al-Yamama. Let's continue to go deeper in the ground and enter the pre-Islamic period. The pre-Islamic period was found in very small context because usually it's at the bottom of sanding. These sanding were dug into the sand. So the deeper you go and the most dangerous it becomes. So we have to reduce the size of the sanding so that when we reached the pre-Islamic occupation, it was usually 1 by 2 meters wide. And it never yielded architecture, only shards, except on one spot, just behind the Qibla wall of the mosque. We did this trench. And in that place, we discovered a pre-Islamic occupation. These are the walls of this pre-Islamic occupation. We have a small kitchen here, a small room just built next to the kitchen, an open-air cooking area with a tanur, a sink, just a sink for water, a kind of cistern or processing structure. And this is a very raw architecture. It's built, it's even not mud brick, it's just earth packed to build the walls. So it's kind of raw architecture, but what was interesting once again is to date the occupation of that architecture. And there we have a pottery production which is different from what we have in the later occupation. We have once again import of glazed pottery from the 3rd century BC. And in all the pre-Islamic context where we did datings, what's interesting is that the C14 datings always gave us the indication of a 4th, 3rd century BC occupation. And that's it. Which means that between the 2nd century BC and the 7th century AD, there is no occupation discovered so far on that site. There is a gap, a clear gap in the occupation of the site. So these are the remains we discovered for the late pre-Islamic and Islamic periods. Let's move now to the former period, what I call the proto-history, the Bronze and Iron Age. This period is not attested at al-Yamama, and we discovered this in other areas in necropolises. These necropolises are clusters of tombs which looks like that place. In the oasis of al-Kharj, there are many, many tombs, more than 5,000 tombs so far. This figure has been obtained by counting them on satellite imagery. So we just pinpointed every of these tombs or cluster of tombs on satellite imagery. And we reached that figure of approximately 5,500 tombs in that area. And as you can see on the picture, we have isolated tombs, but in some places there are some clusters, concentration of tombs, what I call the necropolises. And the 3 main necropolises are those of Jibal al-Rus, more than 500 tombs, the Sandstone outcrop of al-Abja with more than 1,500 tombs, and the most impressive one is Ain al-Dhila with approximately a bit less than 3,000 tombs. And this is how it looks like from this aerial picture taken by a kite. This is the sandstone outcrop of al-Abja. So you can see that the tombs are not in the valley, not in the plain. They are on rocky areas in that outcrop. And below, it's on the limestone plateau of Ain el-Vila, just on the border of the plateau. When you go far away on the plateau, there is no more any tomb. All the tombs are concentrated just on the edge of the plateau. There are different kinds of tombs. Dry stone tumulus, just a heap of stones, in fact. Circular or rectangular tombs. There are also more monumental of these tombs, the stepped circular tombs with the superimposition of shafts. We discovered also this kind of tomb with ring walls and a specific kind of architecture in the form, what we call the cuneiform tombs, because it has the same shape as the cuneiform script in Mesopotamia, and it has been called by the past also tapered structures. It's just a long wall which widens at the end with a small rectangular chamber in it. To give you an example, we excavated at Ain el-Vila 2 areas, and you can see here the density of these tombs. And these are the kind of tombs we excavated. So these are mainly round or square graves with a small chamber. The chamber is only 1 meter by 1 meter, so it's not really large. It's very small. It's very difficult, in fact, to excavate because there is no space to enter it. Well, anyway, we have that kind of tomb and, of course, these long tapered structures I mentioned, which are sometimes as long as 18 meters. And once again, even if the structure is quite long, the chamber is almost very small. The main problem we faced during this excavation is that all these tombs were looted. And it's not a recent looting, in fact. They have been looted all along their history, even in the Bronze Age, even in the Iron Age. So in none of these tombs did we find complete skeletons, a complete set of artifacts deposited, only small fragments. We, let's say, were lucky enough to discover the remains of 7 individuals, and when I say an individual, it can be a single bone sometime, or sometimes just crushed bones in powders. But anyway, we have 7 individuals identified in these tombs, and it makes it possible to make some statements. First, they are always individual graves. These are not collective graves. It's not the same as what we find, for example, in the Oman Peninsula with the Umanar graves, where you can have hundreds of bodies. No, it's individual graves. And these are, when it's possible to see it, primary burials, which means that the body was buried just after the death. Because we discovered the small bones in some cases, which are lost when you move a corpse long after the death. And we also discovered what we call the anatomical connections, which means a set of bones from the arm or the leg and so on, which means that there were primary burials, and it has its importance. I will discuss this later. And the third thing which was interesting is that they have been reused in time. For example, that grave. We excavated the chamber, and at the bottom you have a first body that was deposited. It has been dated by the analysis of the bones, C14 analysis. It has been dated to the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the early Bronze Age. Then the tomb, the chamber collapsed. It was visited, looted, abandoned. It filled up with sand, and it was reopened and reused, and another body was buried in an upper layer in the same tomb in a later period, in the Iron Age. So some of these tombs were very convenient for people just to come back, reopen the grave, inhumate a body, and close it in the Iron Age. But as far as we know, all these tombs were built in the Bronze Age. We don't have any evidence of such a tomb freshly built in the Iron Age. And these are the very few artifacts discovered inside these tombs. They are very rare, but quite interesting. We have some beads, seashell beads, carnelian beads, here a socketed spear head, the end of a spear, and the most interesting feature is that sickle sword. It's in bronze. It was discovered in a grave that has been dated to the late 3rd millennium BC, which means that this is the most ancient sword discovered so far in the Arabian Peninsula. And we don't have any parallel for that kind of sickle sword in the entire Arabian Peninsula, except in rock art. In rock art, we can see some figures handling device that looks like this. It's difficult to say if it's a bronze sickle sword, but this is the only comparison we have so far. This is a very interesting feature. It has been restored by the National Museum at Riyadh, and it is displayed these days at this museum. This is the datings we had in the different tombs we excavated when it was possible to retrieve some bones. The datings have been done on the bones, and there is a consistency in the occupation of these graves. These graves were occupied or used between 2300 and 1800 BCE, which is contemporary to the Dilmun graves in Bahrain, for example. You have huge necropolises with, let's say, similar, even if it's a bit different for the funerary chamber, but similar kind of graves. So it's contemporary. It's also contemporary with the Umanar graves in Oman. And in some cases, as I said, they could have been reused in a later period. What is interesting to notice is that I mentioned different architectural kind of tombs. The question was, is it simply different tradition at different period of time? According to the dating, no, because we can see that the different kind of tombs have been built at the same period of time, and they have been found in the same necropolises. So the question is, do they belong to different population living together in the area, or is it a kind of marking difference, a social difference between some persons within a community? We don't have the answer so far, but what we can say is that they are clearly contemporary. So I'd like now to make a quite, not a conclusion, but kind of synthesis of all this. So we will come back from the past to the present and see what could have been the settlement process in Central Arabia. I pulled together all the C14 datings we have for the different excavations at El Yamama in the necropolises. And there are two remarks to be done. Firstly, you can see that we have occupation, no occupation, occupation and a gap, an occupation and a new gap. So there are clearly phases where we have evidence of occupation and no evidence of occupation. I don't enter into detail because there are some explanations for every of these gaps, but we can discuss this in the discussion afterwards. And there is also a second thing that can be noticed on that chart, is that there is clearly two different periods of times for the occupation of the area of al-Athar. There is a first period here, the Bronze and Iron Age, for which the only remains we have are the tombs, necropolises. We don't have a single settlement, no village, no town, no built structures except tombs for that period, which raised the issue to know whether people were mobile groups or settled groups. I would think, considering this archaeological data, that they were mobile groups of population. Now, the other question was, were they mobile in a wide region, and moving a lot, or just living in the neighborhood? And we have some evidence to answer this question. The first is that I mentioned the two big necropolises, the largest one. What is interesting to notice is that one of these is located just next to the spring, the Artesian Spring I mentioned at the beginning. The second one is just located next to sinkholes, so they are clearly connected to the sources of water. And the second interesting thing is that this blue task corresponds to what we call paleolakes. These were lakes active in the Holocene, the 6th, 5th millennium BC. So you will tell me, okay, but we are in the 3rd millennium BC. Yes, and at that time there was no water anymore. However, we can assume that there were, even if not lake, at least grazing areas for herds, so preferential grazing areas. And I think that population were just moving around in this neighborhood because there was water, there was grazing areas for the herds, and they were buried in these necropolises. And the other thing that made me think that they just live in the neighborhood was these primary burials I mentioned before, which is that when they died, they were just buried nearby. We have these primary burials showing that people were not brought back from far away. So this is the few evidence that we have to say that this was probably mobile populations, not settled populations, but living in a small area. And then we enter in a second period of time, which is the period for which we have settlements. So at what point, that would date to the mid-1st millennium BCE, people started to settle down in the valley. You can see that the location of the sites is totally different. Now they are located in the valleys, in the alluvial plain, where it was possible to practice agriculture. And from that time onwards, we can see the appearance of settlements. The reason why people started to settle down at that time could be connected with caravan trade. In the 1st millennium BC onwards, from the 7th century BC onwards, caravan network linked South Arabia with Mesopotamia and the Near East for the trade of frankincense, of myrrh, and other aromatics. And a regular caravan trade started to develop in the 7th century BCE. And in the mid-1st millennium BCE, Gerra, which is in the region of El-Hufuf in eastern Arabia, became also a major trading center connected to South Arabia, connected to North Arabia. And you can see that in between Gerra and Najran, between Gerra and Taima, we have the site of El-Yamama. And possibly the presence of this trading network contributed to the emergence of settlement in that watered area to host the caravan and to serve as a stopping place along this network, this exchange network. We have evidence of agriculture at that time, so we see that people were not just herders, but also practiced agriculture. We have an archaeobotanist working with us, someone who is specialized in analyzing the botanical rests, seeds, charcoals, and she noticed the presence of wheat and barley seeds, and also the presence of date palm tree. And plus, we have also evidence of camel herding and goat and sheep with the archaeological studies, the study of the ancient bones, showing herding and consumption of goat and sheep, and also the hunt of gazelles. And one of the major bone remains were that of lizard. We found a lot of lizard bones, the dub, uromastics. And these bones show cut marks, which means that they were eaten. So it was part of the food they had at the time. Then we have the Islamic occupation of the region. We can see that the site of al-Yamama became bigger, and at that time it seems that the agricultural capacity increased considerably. And there are some arguments for this. I mentioned the spring, I mentioned the sinkholes, and these two sources of water, of fresh water that could be used for agriculture, are not located in areas that can be cultivated. They are in rocky areas. So the interest was the possibility to bring the water from the sources to the palm groves and the cultivated areas. And to do so, people built these long subterranean canalizations, bringing this water here over 5 kilometers and the water from the sinkholes toward the palm groves. And these are monumental hydraulic devices that we call kanats or kharaz. And it's very difficult to know when they have been implemented. We have some evidence in the 11th century with Nasir Khusro, a Persian traveler, describing al-Yamama site and its canalizations. So it has been built previously to the 11th century AD. And my opinion is that that was built when Persian communities were living in Central Arabia for mining activity and agricultural activity in the 6th and 7th century AD. This, we have some proofs in Islamic sources, especially al-Hamdani, mentioning these communities. In Persia, this kind of hydraulic engineering was well known for centuries, and it's possible that they brought this technology in Central Arabia at that time. And that time corresponds to the development of the large city of al-Yamama, so it's consistent once again. And we can see through the different environmental studies that the agriculture diversified with the chickpeas, also sorghum, and the cotton. And the culture of cotton is important because it requires water, so it means that people were able to bring huge quantity of water, and also the presence of cattle, of chicken, besides the other species. So this is the progressive evolution of the settlement process in al-Kharj, from mobile populations living in the area in the Bronze and Iron Age to the progressive settlement, the settle down of this population in the 4th century BC, connected to the trade, and then the implementation of huge hydraulic systems permitting the development of large cities with craft activities, trade activities, and of course this huge mosque. Thank you very much.